In our previous lesson, we looked at two testaments, looking at the Old and the New Covenant. And I'd like to dovetail into the idea that there's one law. So quickly, let's review what we talked about under the other lesson, two testaments, and then we'll talk about the idea of one law. We talked about the idea of what is a covenant. And if you remember, a covenant is a contract or a testament. It might be referred to as the last will and testament. And of course, we have in the Bible two testaments. We have the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And we sometimes might refer to the New Testament as the last will and testament of Jesus Christ. We talked about the idea of the dispensations, meaning the different time periods in history, that God has spoken to man differently in three different dispensations or time periods. There was the patriarchal, where God spoke directly to man or to the fathers. The Mosaical, where the law was written down. And then, of course, the Christian dispensation. This is the time period under which we live now, because as we read over in Hebrews chapter 1, and let's take a look at that, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. You see there it's describing how God spoke in the past and in different ways, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. So even though God spoke in different ways and to different people in the past, in these last days he's spoken to us through his Son, Jesus the Christ. So the time period we're talking about now is the Christian dispensation, because we are followers of Christ and his law. And of course we ask the question, which law or which covenant are we under? And we saw that no one is amenable to laws which were made for a time period which is past. You know, if the law that said you can't tie your horse to the city hall, was under the law books in 1885, but those laws didn't get carried over, then that law doesn't apply to me. If that law has been stricken from the books, it doesn't apply to me. Okay? So in the same sense, I'm not amenable to those laws that were made for a specific time period that has passed. And the confusion enters when we forget the distinction. Some people, as we mentioned, worship and honor the Sabbath today, even though that law is not carried over under the New Covenant. Some people claim that we have authority for instrumental music in the worship because of what was done in the Old Testament type of worship. Again, that does not apply to us today because those laws were not carried over under the New Covenant. So now, to the point of what we want to deal with today, the idea of one law. Only one law is in effect at a time. And by law, I'm not talking about a specific law, like don't park next to a fire hydrant. I'm talking about the entire compendium of laws. There's only one law in effect at a time. We do not live under the Old Testament and the New Testament simultaneously. Because once the new law comes in, the old law is set aside. It isn't that the old law did not serve its purpose, but the time for its being in effect is past. Let's look at Galatians chapter 3, verses 23 through 25. Here Paul writes to the church in Galatia and talks about the purpose of the old law. Before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith, which should afterwards be revealed. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster or child leader, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. What was the law to do? To lead us to our true divine teacher. After that faith has come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. When we arrive at the teacher, the child leader, whose job is to take us to the teacher, when we arrive at the teacher, the child leader turns us over to the teacher. As we talked about, the child leaders in this first century would take the child from the family to the school where the teacher was, but when that time came that they arrived, they'd hand the child over to the teacher. It's now your responsibility to listen to the teacher. Well, Paul is using this same analogy and saying that's what the Old Testament was. The Old Testament was our child leader to lead us to the true teacher, Jesus the Christ. And what happens when we arrive under the feet of Jesus the Christ? We're no longer under the schoolmaster. We're no longer under the child leader. So the Old Testament is no longer under effect. In Hebrews chapter 8, let's look at verses 6 through 13. We get a similar kind of idea. In Hebrews 8, starting in verse 6, now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he, referring to Jesus, is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with him, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. In that he saith, A new covenant he hath made the first old, now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. You see the imagery there? The old was in effect, but now with the new covenant, the old is ready to be set aside. It's ready to be put away. So the point again is we do not live under two laws simultaneously. Along the same line, we do not live under different versions of the New Testament law. There is only one law in effect today, and that is the law of Christ. Well, you might say, well, that's pretty obvious, right? But Satan comes in and tries to trick us into acting as if there's two different laws that we're under. And Satan is described in the Bible as very wily and very smart and very sneaky. And he does it sometimes without us knowing it. Sometimes even within the church of Christ. In Matthew 28, notice verse 19. What we see is all that live in this Christian dispensation are amenable to the law of Christ. What does that mean? Everybody in the world today will have to answer to the law of Christ. Okay? Notice what he says. Go ye therefore and teach all nations. Well, I want to underline there, all nations. All nations are supposed to be taught what Jesus wants them to be taught. Do you see how that applies to everybody? How many people did Jesus want following his law? All nations. How many people are supposed to be taught his law? All nations. How many people will answer to his law? All nations. All nations under heaven today are amenable or answerable to the law of Christ. 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul says it this way, The things thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. Well, what are they teaching? The laws of Christ. How many people should they teach? As many men as they can and get it out there to. And what should they teach? The laws of Christ. Okay. So now that we understand that, we're all under one law and we're all answerable to the law of Christ. The problems come in when we start combining duplicitous laws together. When we try to follow two laws simultaneously, or we try to take one law and break it up into multiple laws. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's first talk about problems when we try to apply two different laws for the same time period. In other words, we have problems when we try to combine the Old Testament and the New Testament at the same time. I've already alluded to some of these, like worshiping on the Sabbath or honoring the Sabbath. Well, don't you follow Christ? Yes, we follow Christ. Yes, we are Christians, but we're going to honor the Sabbath. Well, you're trying to combine Old Testament laws that are not into effect under the New Testament. You're trying to live under two laws simultaneously. That's like me going down and, if I get arrested for something and the judge pulls out the 2018 Wisconsin law book, and then he pulls out the 1895 Wisconsin law book and says, I'm going to try you under both of these. You're like, what in the world is that? And the penalty for whatever I did under one might be, 30 days in jail. The penalty for the other one might be 5 years in jail. Oh, that's a big difference. You can't try me under both law books at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. Well, when we try to combine Old and New Testament laws, it doesn't make any sense. If we try to worship on the Sabbath or honor the Sabbath, it doesn't make sense. 9 of the 10 commandments that we read about in the Old Testament are repeated in the New. But what we find in the New Testament is honoring the first day of the week. We find in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, on the first day of the week when the disciples came together to break bread, to partake of the Lord's Supper that Paul preached unto them. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, we see even about giving. Paul tells the church at Corinth, on the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by in store. There was a major shift in Judaism to Christianity, and one of those components of that major shift is the day of worship. And this may be one of the reasons the Jews found it hard to switch religions. You can't just change everything. That's a lot of change. But instead of honoring the Sabbath under the new law, we're to honor the first day of the week. I mentioned about music as well. One argument I've heard, from music in the instrumental music in the worship, well, we see it in the Old Testament. Well, that doesn't justify the use of it in worship today, because all we see recorded in the New Testament is singing. Now, if the Old Testament recorded instrumental music in the worship, and we see that it was authorized by God, and it was carried over to the New Testament, then we better be doing it in the New Testament time. In Ephesians 5:19, speak to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. And let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, in Colossians 3, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So obviously there's confusion and problems that come in when we try to live under two laws that are different simultaneously. And we don't need that. We need to remember we're only under one law at a time. Problems also arise from attempting to selectively apply the laws of Christ. The way I look at it is, if you selectively apply the laws of Christ, you're basically making two laws. You're saying the laws apply in this situation, but the laws don't apply in this situation. Well, how come we're under two laws? I thought we were only under one. Let me explain more of what I mean. In essence, the laws of Christ may get applied when it's convenient, but not applied when inconvenient. Essentially creating two laws. The law of Christ when it's convenient for me, and the law of Christ for when it's inconvenient for me. One of the examples I want to throw out is marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Jesus' laws clearly state that fornication or adultery is the only acceptable cause for divorce. Matthew 19:9, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. Now, man tries to get around this by stating if you're divorced for a different reason, in other words, you have an unscriptural divorce, one that wasn't for fornication or adultery, then you've committed a sin. You were married and you had an unscriptural divorce. But man tries to get around the law that says if you're baptized, the sin of an unscriptural divorce is forgiven and you don't have to leave the new unlawful marriage. Well, is the sin of unscriptural divorce forgiven? Can be. Sin can be forgiven, but the question is, what about the sin of the unlawful marriage that you're in? That's left out. The problem is that repentance is left out regarding the unlawful marriage, and a new law is created for those that were baptized. This marriage is unlawful, and you need to get forgiveness of this sin, but after you're baptized, you don't have to get out of the marriage now. Well, wait a minute. If I don't have to get out of the marriage now because it's wrong, why did I have to get baptized in the first place if it wasn't wrong? Say, well, what was wrong was the unscriptural divorce. Okay, well, if the divorce is unscriptural, that puts me in an unlawful marriage, doesn't it? And if the marriage is unlawful before baptism, why is the marriage now lawful after baptism? That's two different laws. A law for when it's convenient and a law when it's inconvenient. If the marriage is wrong before baptism, it's wrong after baptism. What makes the marriage unlawful? It violates the law of God. Did the law of God change after I got baptized? No. Then the marriage is still unlawful. What happens is we try to apply two different laws. I have a law before I'm baptized, and now I have a different law after I'm baptized. That's not right. A new law is not created just because you're baptized. That's a double standard. It's a law of Christ for those who have not been baptized, and a law of Christ for those who have been baptized. If the new marriage is lawful, we need to stop telling people who've been divorced unscripturally their new marriage is wrong. And they do not need to get baptized in order to get that sin forgiven, because there is no sin. But if the new marriage is unlawful before they're baptized, what makes it lawful after they're baptized? Well, what about salvation? Those who've never heard the gospel. I've probably heard it, and you probably have too. How can a loving God send anyone to hell who's never had a chance to hear the gospel? Tough question, isn't it? But if I say a loving God will not send anyone to hell who's not had a chance to hear the gospel, I'm saying there's a law of Christ that applies to those who have heard the gospel and a different law of Christ for those who haven't heard the gospel. Am I not? I'm saying I need to hear the gospel and I need to obey it because I've heard it. But those over there who've never heard it, they don't need to obey it. Right? That's in essence what I'm saying. I have a law of Christ because I've heard it, but those people over there who've never heard it, they don't have to obey the law of Christ. Well, why did Jesus go tell us to teach all nations if they weren't amenable to it? If I know the gospel and I choose to be evil, then I'm going to hell like I deserve. But if someone else has never heard the gospel and they're still evil, God won't send them to hell. That's two laws. That's saying that there's two different laws of Christ that we're living under. You know what? That also makes God an unjust God. Acts 10:34 says, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. If I have to obey the law, why doesn't the guy over there have to obey the law? Just because he hasn't heard it, you're saying, he doesn't have to obey because he hasn't heard it. Well, why do I have to obey it? Because I heard it and that guy doesn't have to obey God. That makes God a respecter of persons, and that makes God unjust. God gave one law, and that one law is for the whole world. Look at Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 21. Tell ye and bring them near, yea, let them take counsel together. Who hath declared this from ancient time? Who hath told it from that time? Have not I the Lord? And there is no God else beside me, a just God. What does that mean? It means he follows through with the laws that he set forth. When he said there's sin and there's a penalty for sin, you better believe there's sin and there's penalty for sin. And that applies to everybody, whether they've heard the gospel or whether they haven't heard the gospel. If everybody's okay, if they haven't heard the gospel, then why in the world do we evangelize? If they're saved without hearing the gospel, then why in the world would I go tell them about the gospel and jeopardize their salvation? Because if they hear the gospel and decide not to obey it, now they're lost. And if I'd have just left them alone, they'd have been saved. But that's not what Jesus says, does he? He says, go into all the world and teach all nations. Make disciples. Why? Because if they don't hear, they're going to be lost. What about those who live a good life but never obeyed? That's another tough one, isn't it? Because you know people, and I know people, and you probably have people in your family, and I've had people in my family who may have been really good, but they never obeyed. And some may think, even if people heard and didn't obey, they lived such a good life, they were such a good man, they were such a good woman, that God can't condemn them to hell. Well, how many laws are there? Is there a law for people that are really good and a law for people that are really bad? Or is there just one law? Those who live a good life but never obeyed. Well, this makes salvation based on good works, not on obedience. He was a really good man. She was a really good woman. Well, then it doesn't matter if you obey God. It just matters how many good works you do, if that's the case. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. What are we saying? It takes faith and it takes works to be saved. I can't just have one or the other. I can't just have faith but then not do any works, right? What does James say in James 2:17? If it doesn't have works, it's dead. I got to have faith, I got to believe, but then I got to go do works and obey. I got to do both. Good works alone, without the faith, doesn't cut it. Not according to the law of Christ. Jesus said it himself in Hebrews 5, or not, he didn't say it himself right here in Hebrews, but talking about Jesus, it says, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. What if Jesus had believed and didn't do any works? Where would we be? Being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation to whom? To all those that obey him. Who does he give eternal salvation to? Those that obey. Well, I did a lot of good works. Well, that's great. But did you obey God? That's the question. What did Jesus say in Matthew 7? Not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. It doesn't matter if you gave out ham sandwiches to the poor, if you worked like Mother Teresa, worked your fingers to the bone helping the poor. The question God wants to know is, did you do the will of my Father? That's what Jesus wants to know. Now, good thing is, if you do the will of your Father, you'll be out helping people. You'll be out doing good works, because that's what God wants you to do. But he doesn't want you to just go do good works and not obey him, because it doesn't work that way. My friend Philip asked this question basically when people talk about, but he was such a good man, she was such a good woman, how can God send them to hell? How many ham sandwiches does it take to wash away sin? How many chicken nuggets do we need to give to the poor to wash away our sin? Tell me, because if there is, I'm going to go down to the store right now and I'm going to clean them out of chicken nuggets and ham sandwiches. If that's what I got to do to wash away my sin, I'm going to go clean the store out. But it doesn't work that way, does it? I can do as many good works as I possibly can all my life, but I never have faith and I never obey God. I'm lost. That's all there is to it. If ham sandwiches and good works and chicken nuggets can take away sin, why in the world did Jesus Christ come down and die a cruel death on the cross? Why didn't he come down and just say, just buy chicken nuggets and you'll be all right? And that brings us to our final point, Satan's lie. Satan is told a different lie, but what may be his greatest one is still being believed by men, including Christians. And that lie is, yes, there are rules, and yes, the rules apply, just not to me under these circumstances. In other words, I believe the law of Christ. I believe that there is right and wrong. I believe that there is a moral, compass of certain things are right and certain things are wrong, but just not to me right now under these circumstances. Selectively applying the law of Christ and, in effect, creating two laws. One for everybody else and one for me. And, ladies and gentlemen, that's a lot of what sin is in a nutshell. Because even the atheist who does not believe in God will claim there are certain things you should do and there are certain things you should not do. But when you go to them and say, well, why don't you stop this sin that you're doing? They say, that doesn't apply to me. That rule doesn't apply to me. Because there's a separate law for everybody else and there's a separate law for me. And Christians, unfortunately, do that same thing. We can fall into that same lie of Satan. Everybody else should be following this law, but not me right now under this circumstance. There are rules, and the rules apply, just not to me under these circumstances. Some examples. I know a Christian should obey the laws of the land, but everyone else is speeding and I'm running late. The rules apply, just not to me right now under this circumstance. I know stealing is wrong, but I'm on vacation and I'm only gambling with some extra money I have. The rules apply, just not to me right now under these circumstances. I know that cheating on your income tax is wrong, but I've given the government enough of my money and I deserve this. And if somebody else cheats, that's wrong, but not me under this circumstance. Well, how far do we want to take this? Do you want to follow it out to its logical conclusion? How far do you want to take it? I know murder is wrong, but just not for me under this circumstance. Is that where you want to go? You want to go that far? Because that's where you're headed. If you do it with one sin, why not any sin? Why not? They're all the same in God's eyes. Satan is even getting Christians to fall for this lie and saying they believe there is a law, but the circumstances of the moment, whether it be the marriage I'm in, or the life situation I've created for myself, or maybe it's the individual involved, the really good man or the really good woman, that has to rewrite the law of Christ because I don't like it that way. Well, I'll admit, the law of Christ might feel like a tough pill to swallow every now and then, but you don't have the power and you don't have the authority to rewrite the law of Christ, and neither do I.